On April 30th, 1945, in a bunker beneath the burning ruins of Berlin, Adolf Hitler put a pistol to his head and pulled the trigger. Above him, the city was a landscape of total destruction. The Reich Chancellery was rubble, the factories were silent, the trains had stopped running, the currency was worthless. The German economy, which had been the most productive war machine in human history just 3 years earlier, had disintegrated into ash and starvation. But the question that haunts historians is not how Germany lost. The question is how Germany ever managed to fight at all. In 1933, when Hitler took power, Germany was a broken nation. It was crushed by debt, humiliated by defeat, and hollowed out by hyperinflation. The Treaty of Versailles had designed the German economy to fail. Yet within 6 years, this bankrupt state had built the most powerful military force on the continent. It had rearmed in secret. It had employed millions. It had conquered Europe. How? The answer is not found in the brilliance of German engineering or the discipline of the German soldier. The answer is found in the darkest chapters of human greed. Nazi Germany did not build its war economy through innovation or productivity. It built it through theft, slavery, and systematic plunder on a scale never seen before in history. This is the story of the blood economy. It is the story of how a regime transformed an entire continent into a concentration camp designed to extract wealth. It is the story of how millions of people were worked to death to feed a war machine. And it is a reminder that when a nation abandons morality in pursuit of power, it does not become strong. It becomes a parasite that eventually consumes itself. To understand the Nazi economic miracle, we must first understand the desperation that created it. In 1919, Germany signed the Treaty of Versailles. It was not a peace treaty, it was a punishment. The Allies, led by France and Britain, were determined to ensure that Germany could never rise again. They imposed reparations of 132 billion gold marks, an astronomical sum equivalent to roughly $442 billion in today's money. Germany was required to pay this debt through exports, through the sale of state assets, and through the stripping of its industrial capacity. The Ruhr Valley, the industrial heartland of Germany, was occupied by French troops. Coal mines were seized. Factories were dismantled and shipped to France as compensation. The German economy, already devastated by 4 years of total war, was being bled dry by foreign creditors. By 1923, the situation had become catastrophic. The government, unable to meet the reparation payments, began printing money. Hyperinflation exploded. A loaf of bread that cost 250 marks in January 1923 cost 200 billion marks by November. Workers were paid twice a day because by the afternoon, their morning wages were worthless. People burned money in their stoves because it was cheaper than buying firewood. Life savings were wiped out overnight. The middle class was destroyed. The humiliation was total. Into this chaos stepped a series of desperate governments trying to stabilize the economy. In 1924, they accepted the Dawes Plan, a restructuring of the reparations with American loans. The money flowed in, Germany rebuilt. For a few years, the Weimar Republic enjoyed a fragile prosperity. But it was built on borrowed time and borrowed money. When the Wall Street crash of 1929 triggered the Great Depression, the American loans stopped. The German economy collapsed again. By 1932, unemployment hit 6 million. 1 in 3 German workers had no job. The streets were filled with desperate men. The political system was paralyzed, and into this void marched Adolf Hitler. Hitler's rise to power was not based on economic competence, it was based on rage. He told the German people that they had been betrayed. He told them that the Treaty of Versailles was a crime. He told them that Germany's weakness was not the result of economic reality, but the result of a conspiracy. Jews, communists, and foreign powers had stabbed Germany in the back. He promised to tear up the treaty. He promised to stop paying reparations. He promised to make Germany strong again. And in January 1933, he was appointed chancellor. But Hitler had no economic plan. He had slogans. He had rage. What he needed was someone who could turn his vision of rearmament into reality. He found that person in Hjalmar Schacht. Schacht was a financial wizard, a man who had helped stabilize the German currency in the 1920s. He was not a Nazi. He was a nationalist and an opportunist. He believed that Germany's economic problems could only be solved by breaking the rules of international finance. Hitler appointed him president of the Reichsbank and later Minister of Economics. Schacht's task was simple but impossible: rearm Germany for war while the country was broke. while it was forbidden by treaty from having a large military, and while it had no gold reserves to pay for imports of steel, oil, and rubber. Schoch's solution was a combination of brilliance and fraud. He invented a shadow financial system that hid the true cost of rearmament. He created a shell company called Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, the Metallurgical Research Corporation. It was supposedly a civilian company doing industrial research. In reality, it was a front. The company issued bonds called MEFO bills. These bills were used to pay armaments manufacturers. The manufacturers could then redeem the bills at the Reichsbank for cash. On paper, the government wasn't spending money on weapons. It was just guaranteeing private bonds. But in reality, the Reichsbank was printing money to finance a secret arms buildup. Between 1933 and 1938, Germany issued 12 billion Reichsmarks worth of MEFO bills. This was ghost money, debt that didn't appear on the official books. It allowed Hitler to build tanks, planes, and battleships while lying to the world about Germany's military spending. But Schoch's magic trick had a fatal flaw. The MEFO bills would eventually have to be paid. They were coming due in the late 1930s. When they did, the Reichsbank would have to either print vast amounts of money, triggering hyperinflation again, or default on the debt, collapsing the financial system. Schoch knew this. He warned Hitler that the rearmament program was unsustainable. He said that Germany needed to slow down to build a balanced economy. Hitler ignored him. Hitler had no intention of slowing down. He had no intention of paying the debt. He had a different plan. He would go to war, and in war the debt wouldn't matter, because he would pay for it by plundering the countries he conquered. In 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. The economic model of Nazi Germany shifted from fraud to theft. The Nazi war economy was built on a simple principle: take everything. When the Wehrmacht rolled into Poland, it was followed by teams of economists, accountants, and administrators. Their job was not to govern. Their job was to loot. The Germans seized the Polish central bank. They confiscated gold reserves. They took over factories, farms, and mines. They imposed a currency regime that valued the Reichsmark far above its real worth, allowing them to buy Polish goods for a fraction of their value. It was legalized robbery. The Polish economy was integrated into the German war machine. Polish factories were forced to produce for Germany. Polish coal was shipped to German power plants. Polish food was sent to feed German soldiers, and the Polish people were left to starve. In Warsaw, the official food ration for a Pole was set at 669 calories per day, a starvation diet. Jews received 184 calories. The goal was not to feed the occupied population. The goal was to extract maximum value while keeping them alive just long enough to be useful. In 1940, the pattern repeated in France. When France fell, Germany imposed an occupation cost of 400 million francs per day. This was not the cost of maintaining the occupation. This was extortion. The French were forced to pay for their own subjugation. At the artificial exchange rate set by the Germans, this amounted to roughly 20 million Reichsmarks per day, or 7.3 billion Reichsmarks per year. It was roughly half of France's entire national income. France was being bled dry, but the Germans didn't just take money. They took everything. French factories were stripped of machinery. French locomotives were shipped to Germany. French copper, aluminum, and steel were confiscated. French wine, cheese, and grain were requisitioned. The city of Paris, which had been the symbol of European culture, became a supply depot for the German army. The Nazis even took the art. Goering personally looted the museums and private collections of France, stealing paintings by Rembrandt, Vermeer, and Monet. It wasn't just about money. It was about dominance. It was about demonstrating that the conquered had no rights, no property, and no dignity. But the most horrific aspect of the Nazi war economy was not the theft of gold or grain. It was the theft of human beings. In 1942, as the war dragged on and German men were sent to the front, the Nazi regime faced a labor shortage. German factories needed workers. The solution was simple. They would import slaves. The man in charge of this program was Fritz Sauckel, the general plenipotentiary for labor deployment. His job was to round up millions of people from occupied Europe and force them to work in German factories. Between 1942 and 1945, over 12 million people were brought to Germany as forced laborers. They came from Poland, France, Ukraine, Russia, and every corner of the occupied territories. They were not volunteers, they were kidnapped. In Ukraine, German soldiers would surround a village, load everyone of working age onto trains, and ship them west. Families were separated. Children as young as 10 were taken. They were packed into cattle cars without food or water. Many died on the journey. Those who survived were sent to factories, mines and farms, where they worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week. They were fed starvation rations. They were beaten. They were housed in freezing barracks, and if they became too weak to work, they were sent to concentration camps to die. The economics of slave labor were brutally efficient. A forced laborer cost almost nothing. The German state paid the companies a small fee per worker, but the workers themselves received no wages. They were given just enough food to keep them alive. The profit margins for German companies like Krupp, IG Farben and Volkswagen were enormous. They were literally working people to death and pocketing the savings. The most extreme example of this economic logic was the concentration camp system. Camps like Auschwitz were not just extermination centers, they were labor camps. The SS leased prisoners to German corporations. The prisoners worked in factories producing chemicals, munitions, and synthetic rubber. The daily cost to rent a prisoner from the SS was 3 to 4 Reichsmarks. The prisoners received nothing. They were worked until they collapsed, and when they could no longer work, they were murdered. This was not inefficiency. This was the logical endpoint of an economy built on dehumanization. People were not citizens. They were not even workers. They were consumable resources, to be used up and discarded. In 1942, the Nazi war economy reached its peak efficiency under the leadership of Albert Speer. Speer was Hitler's architect, a man obsessed with order and production. He was appointed Minister of Armaments and War Production after his predecessor died in a plane crash. Speer reorganized the entire German economy. He centralized control. He eliminated bottlenecks. He rationalized production. Under his leadership, German arms production tripled between 1942 and 1944. Despite the Allied bombing campaign, despite the loss of territory, despite the shortage of resources, German factories were producing more tanks, more planes, and more guns than ever before. It was called the armaments miracle. But it was not a miracle. It was the result of slave labor and total exploitation. Speer achieved his production targets by working millions of people to death. He knew exactly what he was doing. At the Nuremberg trials after the war, Speer claimed ignorance. He said he didn't know about the concentration camps. He said he was just a technocrat focused on production. But the records show that he personally visited labor camps. He personally approved the use of concentration camp prisoners in his factories. He was not ignorant. He was complicit. The armaments miracle was built on corpses. But by 1944, the Nazi war economy was beginning to collapse under its own contradictions. The problem was simple. Plunder is not sustainable. Germany had conquered an empire, but it had no way to make that empire productive in the long term. Occupied territories were drained of resources. Their infrastructure was destroyed. Their populations were starving. There was nothing left to take. At the same time, Germany's access to critical resources was being cut off. The Allied blockade prevented the import of oil, rubber, and rare metals. Germany tried to develop synthetic alternatives, producing artificial rubber and gasoline from coal, but these were expensive and inefficient. The fuel shortage became critical. By 1945, German tanks were running out of gasoline, planes were grounded, the war machine was sputtering to a halt. The final blow came from the strategic bombing campaign. The Allies targeted German oil refineries, chemical plants, and transportation networks. By early 1945, the German economy was in free fall. Production collapsed. The railways stopped running. Cities had no electricity. The population was starving. The Reichsmark became worthless. Workers were paid in cigarettes and bread. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war was over. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years had lasted 12. The cost was beyond comprehension. Over 60 million people had died. Entire cities were erased. Europe was a graveyard. And the Nazi war economy, which had been built on the promise of making Germany rich and powerful, had left the country in ruins. Germany was divided and occupied. Its people were homeless and hungry. The economic system that had relied on theft and slavery had consumed itself. The lesson of the Nazi war economy is a stark one. A nation cannot build lasting prosperity on plunder. An economy based on theft will always collapse, because theft is finite. Once you have taken everything from your neighbors, there is nothing left. The Nazi regime believed that power came from domination, that strength came from cruelty. But in the end, their economy was a Ponzi scheme of violence. It required constant expansion, constant conquest, constant exploitation. And when the expansion stopped, the entire structure imploded. The human cost of this economic system is incalculable. 12 million forced laborers, 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust, millions of Soviet prisoners of war worked to death, entire nations impoverished and broken. All of this suffering was justified by the Nazis as economic necessity. They claimed they needed the resources. They claimed they needed the labor. But the truth is that the war economy was not efficient. It was wasteful. Slave labor is less productive than free labor. Plunder destroys the productive capacity of the conquered. The Nazi war economy was not a rational system. It was a criminal enterprise dressed up in the language of national survival. And in the end, it destroyed the very nation it claimed to serve. Germany emerged from the war not as a superpower, but as a cautionary tale. A warning to every nation that abandons justice in pursuit of power, because power built on injustice is not power. It is a curse that consumes everything it touches. This is financial injustice. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.